All right, good morning and welcome to the panel on future of freight, opportunities and challenges. I am joined here today by Mr. Eugene Seroka, who's the Executive Director of the Port of Los Angeles. Give Gene a round of applause for flying all the way from California. Also, I'm joined by Mr. Michael Bozza, Deputy Director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for the Port of New York and New Jersey. And Ms. Jessie Solomon, all the way down the end here, who is the Executive Director of the Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corp. In Brooklyn. So as we get started, you guys are facing the wrong direction, but we can certainly see what I consider to be one of the most beautiful views in the world, not only because I worked in New York Harbor for the last 40 years operating ports and terminals and starting my career in 1986 as a dock laborer, but it's really, when you talk about opportunities, I don't think any of us would disagree that the port, whether it's New York, LA, or anywhere else in the country or the world, create massive opportunities for everyone. I think the Port of New York alone employs somewhere in the vicinity of almost 600,000 jobs when you talk about direct and indirect jobs, and I'm sure Gene can tell us very similar numbers or probably even higher numbers in Port of LA, Long Beach. But that also means there's plenty of challenges to go along with that, and we'll talk about some of those today. But to get us started, one of the things that's pretty relevant in today's news is tariffs. Probably up until January 19th, when President Trump took office, we weren't thinking about tariffs, but today we're thinking a lot about them as it impacts all of our lives and businesses, and in particular impacts our ports to a great degree when it comes to volumes of freight moving through them. So I'm going to start with Mr. Seroka and ask him, how have the tariffs impacted the Port of Los Angeles? What does it mean for the future of volume through the port? And most importantly, we had an announcement yesterday reducing those tariffs temporarily. So I'm going to let Gene kick us off here.
Well, thanks, Mike, and great to see everybody. This truly is a fantastic setting. On the subject of trade policy and tariffs, from our perspective in LA, a lot of this discussion began last summer on the campaign trail when talk about changing policy, tariffs of 10% on all imported goods to the U.S., nearly now $4 trillion US, and maybe even 60% tariffs on certain countries were talk in many locations around the country. As that began, we started to see larger importers, or those who had the ability, start bringing in more product, front-loading and building up inventories in the event that trade policy did change. And it sure did. Shortly after Inauguration Day, a series of tariffs were levied, and then on April the 2nd, a larger tariff regime, the most wide-sweeping that we've witnessed in our lifetimes, was implemented. So we saw a lot of run-up in cargo over 9 months. Handled it really well, I think. Shipping lines, terminal operators, truck firms, and railroads. In fact, we moved more cargo in the second half of last year than we did during the notable time during COVID of 21 and 22 without one ship backed up. I'd like to say it's because we learned a lot, we brought a lot of people together, and importers basically moved their cargo off the port really quickly to allow the next round of shipments to enter. In the last month or so, there's been much talk about what those higher tariffs would do, and a lot of importers put the brakes on China cargo. So much so that last week in and of itself, we were down about 30%. The next 2 weeks forward look probably a little bit more than that as far as a drop in cargo. Yesterday's news was pretty welcome. After 2 days in Geneva discussing trade policy between China and the United States, I think the outcome was better than many had thought. But 90 days is not a long time in our business. And 30% on average tariffs from China and the products made there is still a lot of money for many companies. And while a number of folks did bring that inventory in, We've got about 125,000 companies that import to the Port of Los Angeles annually. No one has more than a 5% share. That means small and middle-sized companies make up a pretty good chunk of that population, and they may not have had the opportunity, the ability to bring in extra inventory at those carrying costs to get more warehousing. Now they're kind of stuck. Even though those tariffs in China have come down quite a bit, still buying at a 30% tariff on top of other tariffs that have been introduced over the last 7 years is going to be difficult enough for these businesses. But passing on those costs, like the big guys do, may not be as easy, because that corner store that we have in our neighborhood that's selling lumber and hammers, if they raise the cost of that hammer and the larger company doesn't, they're not going to make too many sales. So we're kind of a crossroads here. I hope that we have an opportunity now to set trade rules that impact American exports and get into more markets, but don't have a detrimental impact to us, the American consumer, that makes up about 70% of the U.S. economy.
I think it's also just important to note before Mike weighs in that 30% tariffs on goods from China is still a record level, even though it's been reduced. I think the number before the 30%, before the Trump administration, was 3% historically. So it is still will have a major impact. Mike Bozza, how do you think the tariffs are going to continue to impact the Port of New York?
Yeah, I think I would say we're similar, but not the same, as my niece always tells me, in that, cargo that's, the cargo that comes to New York and New Jersey, very similar in that we had a huge run-up towards the end of last year and the first quarter of this year. Our first quarter volumes were 10% over and above the same period in 2024. We started to see some softening in the market as we looked ahead to June, July, and August sailings coming here, affecting a very small percentage of our cargo, but it was there as the ocean carriers started to react to, the anticipated tariffs that were coming down the pike. So with this change now, I think what we're going to see, even at 30% and not knowing what the future is going to bring, I think you're going to see another kind of front loading of cargo, right? And perhaps even an early peak season to start bringing in holiday goods and other goods for the end of the year that would typically start coming here in June, July, and August.
90 days is a short period of time. How do you think the markets will react, Gene, with a 90-day window and the uncertainty of what happens after the 90 days?
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of talk yet. Folks that I've discussed this with are still crunching the numbers, because when we saw a lot in the media yesterday and the press releases about 30% tariff on China, that may be an aggregate on the $500 billion of China imports that we receive. But if you're moving baby shoes, they're still in the 90s. Syringes, IV apparatus for healthcare also have a different tariff approach to them as well. So there are going to be certain segments that are still extremely pricey, to the point that was just made by Mike. 30% is a lot of money. I don't know that we see a huge rush based on the bookings that are taking place right now in China. You probably see a little bit of the backlog come this way, and then folks are going to make some pretty heavy bets. Toy companies, seasonal products, those that sell for the holidays, they typically have a 6-week window. That's why we start with Cyber Weekend, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, et cetera, to see if we can get the retail industry back in the black, as they call it. So it's going to be a unique time, and trying to wager also on what the American consumer is going to do. Folks around the Port of LA tell me they're tightening their belts, and they know they're going to get hit in the wallet with these tariffs. So how much money is it going to mean versus their traditional spend for the year-end holidays? I think a lot of questions remain, Mike.
I also think, and Mike, maybe you can touch on this, are the ocean carriers going to be able to reposition? You talk about a 90-day window and have capacity available to take advantage of that window in enough time to really make it meaningful? I mean, have you heard anything from the local carriers that we're dealing with in the Port of New York?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on there, Mike. I mean, you have kind of the readjustment, I would say, of capacity relative to what's happening with the tariffs. A lot of uncertainty there. And then the ceasefire, right, in the Red Sea with the Houthis. If that holds, okay, that's going to redeploy capacity on a much shorter trip now, coming from Asia to the U.S. If you can, you save 2 to 3 weeks if you don't have to go around the Cape of Good Hope. So does that help? Does that hurt? It remains to be seen. But we are in regular contact with the ocean carriers, and I think they're trying to figure it out just like everybody else.
Well, I know, like the Port of Los Angeles, LA Long Beach, who's already seen a significant drop in volumes here in New York, we're expecting to see that ourselves in June, I believe, based on the delay. So let's hope that turns around and we don't see as bad of a reduction in volume.
I would just say to that last point, Mike, our profile is a little bit different here, where we have a very diversified sending base. 25% of our imports come from China, and the rest are spread to India, countries in Europe.
Vietnam
So,
and so forth.
an impact for sure, but, hopefully a little more muted.
And Jesse, have you heard, talking to some of the members of SPITIC, any impacts related to supply chain or shortages or anything that's impacting some of the local manufacturers potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, so SBIDC serves small industrial manufacturing businesses in Southwest Brooklyn. That's Sunset Park, Gowanus, and Red Hook. We provide services to a lot of importers. So, talking to, I would say that every single business we serve is impacted by the tariffs, no matter if they're making 100% of their product here, their packaged material still comes from abroad. But talking to one of our major importers the other day, this was back in early April when the tariffs on China were still 20%. 20% was a major challenge. They import 92% of their product from China, and they were saying that they were able to absorb about a third of the cost of that and then passed on the rest to their customers. But they really saw that as a temporary measure. They were hoping to either look for other sources in different supply chains, different markets, different international markets, or, praying that the tariffs would go away magically. And they knew that, anything higher than 20%, and even to maintain that, would be a real challenge for their business. And just echoing, this first quarter of this year, seeing an increase that, I think that's definitely true of a lot of the businesses we serve who tried to rush and bulk order, but storing all of that product has been a major issue for folks. They're looking for temporary storage in New York City that's really limited. So from New York City small business perspective, your margins are super narrow. It's really hard to take advantage of a period where the tariffs might be lower, like they're about to be, and still be able to maintain their goods.
So I'll just add to that. I mean, some of you who know me know that I started my career working in the banana industry over here in Port Newark. So we don't talk about it a lot, but bananas is one of the largest commodities imported in the U.S. and around the world. And we're now paying tariffs on imported bananas, 10%, like all the other countries that are facing the same issue. And it's a real problem to begin with when it comes to the banana industry in terms of cost and razor-thin margins. Now the growers are facing more challenges with reduction in their ability to market their fruit because of the cost of tariffs. So that's another impact that we don't talk about a lot. I'm sticking with Jesse for a moment. Economic impact of ports. So we're actively involved in a port master plan in Brooklyn, which we're hoping for a good outcome. How does the local port in general impact your members and the local economy in Brooklyn and New York City?
Yeah, that's great. The master plan Mike is referring to is the Brooklyn Marine Terminal planning process that's happening right now, so where the Red Hook Container Terminal is. You can't understate the value the economic development impacts on local communities from port infrastructure. Historically speaking, that's really why we have an industrial waterfront in Brooklyn at all. I mean, ports are a major logistics anchor. They they incentivize other logistics companies, warehouse companies, manufacturing companies, construction supply and distributors to locate near those facilities, and that infrastructure is still here today in Red Hook and in Sunset Park as well. So I think, right now we're in an interesting moment, and sticking with Brooklyn Marine Terminal, I think as ports in New York City start to see some redevelopment, we have an opportunity in New York to really think about how to be intentional about that local impact. So New York City recently passed legislation around community hiring, and that started being implemented January 2025. And that means that any public contracts can have now more meaningful workforce development goals in those contracts. So as we see port redevelopment, we have an opportunity to have workforce development goals that are tied to helping folks from low-income communities get jobs on those major development projects. So that alone, in addition to just the general direct, indirect, and induced jobs from ports, that's going to have a pretty major impact as we see BMT be redeveloped or Hunts Point Marine Terminal be redeveloped. That will really have a meaningful impact, not just on the number of jobs, but who's getting those jobs on those projects. And then, of course, port redevelopment also has major opportunities for small businesses who get contracts on those projects. So my organization in particular looks to help small disadvantaged businesses and MWBEs get those contracts. So we want to see that happen as much as possible as these projects get underway.
Thank you, Jesse. And Gene and I were chatting briefly before we started the panel, and I was happy to hear, I don't know if happy is the right word, but that here in Brooklyn and New York City and the Port of New York, we're not the only ones faced with land use competition between ports and housing. It sounds like that's a recurring theme. What can you say about that in Port of LA?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work, and it's kind of interesting because on occasion you'll see policies roll out, elected officials come in with new ideas, and the housing crisis across the country, and especially in major metropolitan areas, must be dealt with. There is no doubt about that. And plans to date have not necessarily hit the mark. But there's a finite amount of industrial space, especially for transportation, that should be preserved. And I think it was over 500 miles of coastal area in New York City. There's 840 miles of coastal waterway in the state of California. Must be preserved, must be done the right way. But the economic impact of these ports is unbelievable. For every 4 containers we move, it creates a job. It creates about 1 million jobs in the 5-county Southern California area. Economic impact, draw on utilities, possessory use taxes, the ability to build roads and bridges, et cetera. But we still got to be able to create the necessary space to do all that good work, but we got to have affordable housing for folks that want to get into this business, for folks that want to create lives for their families. And it doesn't necessarily have to commingle, because it could be to the detriment of both.
We definitely need both, and one is not mutually exclusive over the other. We need both for sure, which is probably a good segue to Mike, talking about port master planning, and the need for continual infrastructure investments in all ports, but we're particularly focused here on New York today, as well as LA. Can you talk a little bit about the Port Master Plan that was developed 2019, and where that is in terms of development, funding, and what else needs to be done, as infrastructure is a continual challenge?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Port Master Plan was completed 2019, 2020. We released it, and it was a 30-year look ahead to see, where we need to go to handle the volumes that we expect to see, which could be 2 to 3 times what we're handling today. And so how do we get there? It's capital investment, it's jobs, it's looking at operations and making sure that, we run a 12-hour truck gate today. That's not going to work into the future if we're going to continue to handle and manage the cargo that we expect to see. And through the pandemic and just last year, we started to get a glimpse of what the future looks like. The volumes that we handled in 2022 through our master plan forecast were what we would otherwise have expected to see in 2030. So we were fortunate in that we had a glimpse into what's going to happen and what's coming towards us. And we were also fortunate in that we handled it, and we handled it rather efficiently. But plans are great, but you have to move on to implementation, right? And we're doing that. We are investing hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, both through the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey and our tenant partners. We've kicked off in 2023 Port Street Corridor Improvement Project, which is a $220 million effort to completely reconfigure the roadway system at the north end of the port. These were roads that were built back in the 40s and the 50s when trucks were a lot smaller and there wasn't obviously nearly the amount of traffic that we see today. We're moving forward with engineering design agreement with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to deepen the water to 55 feet to handle the largest, newest, and most efficient vessels that want to call here. We're moving forward with rail projects, okay, to increase capacity on our railheads so that we can not just manage all the truck traffic, but we have about 15% of our cargo goes out by rail. And so we're going to need to grow in that as well. We're entering into new agreements with our tenant partners, and these are totally restructuring not just the financial makeup of how we work with them, but also the level of investment. And through those deals, we're going to completely rebuild our wharf structures. Okay, we're in the process now of spending nearly $200 million to do state of good repair on our wharf structures. We did a study back in 2020 around the same time as the master plan, looking at our wharf structures. And at that point in time, we anticipated we would need more than $14 billion just to redo our wharf structures, which continue to, again, some of these are 70, 80 years old, wood timber piles, okay? They're deteriorating as the estuary continues to get cleaner, and it has, and that's a good thing. But marine borer worms love to feed on wooden piles, and so they're accelerating the level of deterioration. But we are entering into new agreements with our tenant partners, okay, to work with us to rebuild those structures. So it's going to take a lot of things, I think, on a lot of different fronts. And we are, 5 years into a 30-year master plan, but I'm glad to say I think we're making good progress so far.
I would agree. And Gene, how does the Port of LA deal with these challenges? State funding, local funding, private funding, how are you meeting your infrastructure needs out in California?
Yeah, it's always front and center, just like Mike said for his port. Our capital plan over the next 2 years is about $2.5 billion US, and the reliance on federal and state partnerships had been exemplified over the past 4 years, where we received about $1 billion in federal and state investment. So what that does for us is it accelerates these projects of terminals, upgrades, states of good repair, just like Mike referenced, and then those connectors of rail and roadways to move even more cargo out more efficiently. Also upgrading the energy system as we have a goal of going to zero emission port handling equipment by the year 2030 and zero emission heavy duty truck operation by the year 2035. You need more electricity, you need to experiment with cleaner and renewable fuels, hydrogen, et cetera. And what we found, similar to here in New York and New Jersey, is that for every dollar we invest, our private sector partners from the industry invest at 2 to 2.5x. So to give them confidence, the government investment comes first, and these guys are fast followers. So that's a constant piece of work and budgeting. Over the last 10 years, our fiscal policies will allow us, even if we do see a dip in cargo for any amount of time based on this shift in policy, we'll be able to invest through cycle. There are about 3,500 construction workers on the ground every day at the Port of LA. I'd like to see, even if there are lower cargo volume, to keep those folks on the job and give us a chance to speed those projects through to completion.
Great, thank you. Infrastructure investment in ports is one of the biggest challenges I think any organization that's leading a port, managing it, or running a terminal is faced with. So it's important that we keep highlighting that challenge. So as I'm looking out, I see the Staten Island Ferry moving people around the harbor. So I want to sort of segue now to how can we move more freight around the harbor by water? Something that we've been talking about for years. We operate, just if anyone doesn't know, we operate a container on barge service in Brooklyn between Newark and Brooklyn that moves about 30,000 intermodal containers a year and eliminates those truck trips from bridges and local roadways. The city of New York has recently started talking more and more about this and is making some announcements about investments in Hunts Point. Jesse, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I know there's another panel coming up on the Blue Highway Network This is a very relevant topic as we, Mike and I both sit on the Brooklyn Marine Terminal Task Force, and as we think about the redevelopment of that site, the city is really invested in thinking about using that site to activate a more robust blue highway network, moving goods on the water instead of via truck. I'm really interested to understand more about the interventions in the private sector that will actually allow users or incentivize users to want to move goods along this new network. How do we disrupt these really entrenched supply chains that are so reliant on moving goods from basically from New Jersey over to New York City, whether it's over to Hunts Point or just throughout the 5 boroughs? I think that's really challenging to do, so I'm interested in understanding more what kind of public-private partnerships need to happen. To your point, what kind of investments need to happen in other sites throughout the city from the public sector to make this network a reality. You know, right now, as Mike was saying, we've heard some good news from the city about investments up in Hunts Point to there's a prison barge site over there, an active correctional facility that will eventually be decommissioned, will soon be decommissioned so that we can use that site for a blue highway activation. But just because we're creating the space there and creating a more efficient route doesn't mean that immediately overnight these supply routes will change, right? So what else can we do through public-private partnerships to disrupt those routes? So I'm curious to hear from some of the colleagues on this panel too, how to do that. But.
I mean, we think mass transit for freight, as I like to call it, really needs to be developed here, in not only New York Harbor, but elsewhere. If we look around the world, most of the largest ports in the world, cities in the world, are using fast ferries or some form of barging or water transportation to move large amounts of containerized goods, bulk goods, and so forth. And, you know, as somebody who runs the largest port in the country on the West Coast, how do you view that, or do you see opportunities in LA and Long Beach to do similar type of activity, and what are the potential challenges there?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. You're always trying to improve your craft. And we have a mutual friend that says if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. They're all very different. They all have unique customers, unique requirements, unique neighborhoods, as well as modalities. So in LA, we're known as, along with our neighbor in Long Beach, as a gateway port. The cargo that comes there typically is on a nonstop service. The entire ship is unloaded and then loaded back straight to Asia. In different parts of the world, different parts of our country, ships make multiple stops. In ours, it's kind of a one-shot in and out. So the ability to do that part of it more efficiently is kind of matching a batch manufacturing process with a conveyance process. Yet in our case, about 2/3 of all the cargo moves in and out of the port by truck over the road. You've all seen pictures of LA traffic. It is very, very challenging, to say the least. Truckers typically get paid by the run. So if they're sitting long hours at a marine terminal waiting to get in and out, no fault of their own, or if they're sitting in freeway traffic, they don't get paid as much. So how do we better fashion? Short haul rail has been a burgeoning concept in the southeast part of the United States. Shorter runs, quicker velocity, faster turns, fewer trucks on the road, thus lowering pollution. So there are different ways, and we've got to be creative and keep, to Jesse's point, being the disruptors and finding unique ways to make that conveyance process smoother and better around the communities that we serve.
Thank you, that's great. So Mike, with 2 bridges being the main arteries for New York City, a city of islands, I know recently the Port Authority started building JFK, rebuilding, and decided to use the water to help move construction materials to that location, which is great. Do you see the Port Authority looking to do more of that type of activity? Is it something that the Port Department is focused on, or is that something that the others at the Port Authority are looking at as more efficient ways of dealing with construction challenges, do you think?
I would say we're looking at it at the Port Department level, and we've been involved in groups in the past and hope to continue them and kind of revitalize them to look at using water routes within the harbor. You know, our challenge has always been getting a return trip, right? Mm-hmm. And Jesse and I were talking about this a little bit before, that if you have a barge that can take boxes up to Albany per se, how do you make it financially feasible that it's not just a deadhead coming back? right? And so we're looking at it at the port level, but we are looking at it agency-wide because the congestion is not just port-related. We have congestion on all our roadways, right? So it's, you know, the Port Authority is committed to, you know, trying to advance any initiatives that take advantage of this water resource that we have. We have a little-known railroad, New York, New Jersey Rail, that actually drays rail cars from New Jersey and Greenville over to New York.
65th Street.
65th Street Rail, correct. And, you know, it's a small asset, but let me tell you, it's a great way to get stuff across the harbor, right, until we can leverage more of that and get more velocity on an asset like that.
I think that's great. And as somebody who's been trying to help develop some of these things, one of the greatest challenges is getting folks to really change the way they think about logistics, right? Whether you're moving bananas or aggregates or, you know, water. I won't mention names, but we visited many facilities that were looking for new ways to actually move their goods in and out of the region, but nobody wanted to be the guinea pig to actually do it first. So that's really part of the challenge too, is changing people's mindsets. Gene, recently you were talking to Yahoo Finance as well. The tariff challenges are coming up. To touch back on that, talk about your 5-to-1 ratio of exports and imports and how that impacts your port.
Yeah, it's unique. As a nation, we import more than we export, which seems to be central to this discussion about trade policy. A little closer to home, when you talk about how this cargo flows and what it does with the available infrastructure, with the communities, with the people that rely on the work that we do, it becomes very interesting, because to the point that was just made, it's about round-trip economics with many of these transportation providers. Can I bring as much stuff in one way as I can and complement that with a similar amount of cargo going in the opposite direction? And that's not what we have when it comes to imports and exports. Imports are traditionally finished goods, but not talked about a lot. About the same amount of cargo that comes through Los Angeles are parts and components for American factories. Factories tend to be located in more rural locations, as does the majority of our exports from the agricultural sector. Most of our imports, those finished goods, go to metropolitan areas where many of us live and many of us consume. So trying to triangulate something that is meant to be a round trip adds to the complexity. And when we wind up shipping back empty containers in large volume, that impacts the economics of not only those service providers, but those who are providing for those shipping lines, meaning the export community. So as an example, in Los Angeles County, we boast one of the largest areas for manufacturing jobs in the country, just shy of 400,000 people. Yet the companies they represent only export 1% of their output. So these are a couple of opportunities here as we talk about trade policy and some of the latent capacity, whether it be on ship, rail, truck, or the use of those containers, to maybe up the game a little bit, which will have a direct impact on local, state, and national economies.
What about empty containers? Is that an issue in the Port of LA and repositioning or repatriating empties out? Or are you finding yourself with too many empties in the port and no place to put them? Has that been an issue in LA?
Yeah, during COVID, and you say you maybe have once in a lifetime at this, we've now seen that we have twice in a lifetime. So look at this and have the spotlight on the supply chain broadly, right? And the various members of the private sector that help us. So if ships aren't coming in, exports are not going out. And if you have a dearth of exports, those empty containers pile up. We're in a pretty decent spot right now, but those numbers will catch up to us at some point if we don't start receiving more vessels based on cargo coming out of China at whatever level of tariff we begin to discuss. So there is a delicate balance about how you keep these terminals fluid, the roadways the same, and still have that cycle or velocity of containers, both laden and empty, moving along the transit paths. We're in good shape now, but you could see that tipping at some point in the not too distant future.
It certainly poses potential challenges, and I know, Mike, we've had some issues here, but I think the Port Authority's done a great job in managing it, working with the terminals. Is there anything you want to touch on regarding excess empties and how we're managing that issue here in New York and New Jersey?
Sure. And Gene hit the nail on the head. It's a balancing act all the time. We saw this for the first time, thinking it would be a once-in-a-lifetime event, during the pandemic, and we were just getting overwhelmed with empties. The ocean carriers were bringing in import volume, and they were cutting and running to their next destination as fast as they could. They did not want to wait for the load back on empties, and so they piled up. And so what we did here in the Port Authority, and I think you may have a similar tariff measure, but we implemented new rulemaking through our marine terminal tariff that basically says if you're going to keep empty containers here for X period of time, you're going to pay for them. And at the end of the day, money talks. Nobody wanted to be paying for airspace sitting on a terminal somewhere, and just having that rule in place really was able to change behavior, and we were able to get a heavy evacuation of containers. And it's funny, we're talking here about a lot of things. Changing behavior is kind of a critical thing. You can talk about investment, right, and everything that goes, bless you. A lot of what we do is trying to change behavior or facilitate behavior, right, so that we can keep the supply chain moving efficiently. And so our empty balance fee is one tool that we use to try to, reset that lever. And to Gene's point, you start to see a little bit of a tipping point going back that way as people are rushing cargo, into the U.S.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm glad to see so many people decided to attend this session, because it certainly, as you can see, we have some of the top leaders in not only the Port of New York and New Jersey here, but the Port of LA, and we all face similar challenges. Our businesses are not exactly the same. As Gene said, you've seen one port, you've seen one port, but we have some remarkable leadership on both coasts that are meeting the day, meeting the moment. In terms of challenges, we had Superstorm Sandy here, which knocked out the port for a while. Then we had the pandemic. Now we're having similar, volume, surges and decreases. So working in the port business is never boring. I can tell you that. In the almost 40 years that I'm doing this, every day is a new challenge. Any questions from the audience that we could field today, where you guys are all here and we're wrapping up soon? Go ahead, Caroline.
Hi, so it's for Port Authority, and this is, I'm Carolina Salgaro of the Maritime Nonprofit Ports at New York. So this is following up on the mention of the barge port at JFK, and following up on an email I sent to Beth Mooney as soon as I read about that, asking if that could be used in marine highway. And I want to know if you're studying that use after you're finishing the construction, but I also want to ask if you're studying it not just freight in, freight out, but flying with passengers. I mean, I was at a conference somewhere between 2002 and 2005 about that kind of proposal for down there. There's a proposal done for a freight ferry out of Pier 40 in Western Park to Newark air freight done by Tom Fox and Roberta Weisbrod, which showed that would not increase costs. I think the target flight was CGS. So I want to know if the Port Authority is looking at that spot for marine highway, and if you are, you're considering the next passengers.
Carolyn, thank you for the question. Are you talking specific to JFK and continuing to utilize that spot?
Yeah, because you have that spot, you have a barge port now, so rather than decommissioning it once it's no longer has a construction use, I want to know if you guys are looking at actually using it for marine highway.
So let me take that back to our aviation folks, all right, because they're more directly involved in that, but I'll talk to the Director of Aviation and we'll get your response for that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, Caroline. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Mark here. There seems to be some misconceptions about how tariffs work. Some folks think the money goes to the government, other folks think that the purchaser, at the end of the day is the one that's paying for the tariff. How does it physically, how does a tariff work?
Well, I'll just start by saying, as an importer, I import bananas every week from Ecuador, and we're now paying a 10% tariff that is being directly deducted from our bank account by U.S. Customs, and it's a very significant amount. So if you're the importer, I think it just really depends on how your company is structured, but usually it's the importer of record, the one making the filing and entry into the U.S. that is paying that duty. Gene, you have a different?
No, it was a very significant announcement yesterday that the federal government collected more than $16 billion in tariff-related assessments last month in April. And that was above the $9 billion collected in the month of March and more than double the $7 billion collected a year ago, April. So it's a significant amount of money that the import community across a variety of industrial segments pays in these tariff fees.
And that you pay that because it's a tax on the amount of money?
The importer of record, say it's a big box retailer. The example was just given on perishable commodities by Mike. Big box retailer bringing in a bunch of men's shirts, as an example. They will pay the tariff duty to U.S. Customs and Border Protection under the auspice of the Department of Homeland Security. And that money goes into the federal treasury. What we're hearing directly from CEOs and board members of importing companies is that while they'll try to negotiate with the manufacturer overseas, they'll try to find efficiencies in their own organization, even at the risk of margin compression, most of these tariffs are attempted to be passed on to the next buyer in the supply chain. If it's a finished good at the retail level, big or small, that means you and me. If it's a manufacturer in the United States, that parts supplier is trying to pass on some of that additional cost to the factory here in the United States. Thanks, Mark.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. I'm a student here at Fordham University. I had a question for you guys. I know you specialize in ports mainly, but you sort of mentioned that a lot of the exports, at least, and indeed some of the imports are coming from Middle America, where there are less ports and less maritime trade available. So where do you see the biggest area for improvement in terms of scope 3 emissions of vehicular transportation of goods? Do you see that in, for example, electric vehicles or changing routes collected or the new Bozza?
Do you want to touch that one?
Thanks for representing the Rams today. Yeah, this is unique, right? In the Port of Los Angeles, as I described maybe before you stepped in, we have a plan on record to convert our cargo handling equipment to zero emission or zero carbon by the year 2030. That's about 2,000 pieces of equipment, from rubber-tired gantry cranes to forklifts to cargo handling units themselves. We call them utility tractors that drive around the marine terminals. 2030. By the year 2035, we'd like to convert all 20,000 Class 8 heavy-duty trucks to be zero emission. Battery electric vehicles along with hydrogen fuel cell electric are being tested today. We've got about 500 that are registered to do business with the twin ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. The question is not only about the technology itself and the affordability of those rigs, but the infrastructure necessary to keep them charged and fueled across a wide variety of geographies that they would cover. Big challenge. We've put a lot of money into this as the Port of Los Angeles, just a municipal agency. State money in California, federal money that's not been completed yet as we've gone through administrations, also present a challenge in how we can get that confidence of the private sector to invest behind us. So reducing air emissions is hugely important, and I'll leave you with this. Last year, we moved the second largest amount of cargo in our 117-year history, and we had the lowest amount of emissions since we began measuring 20 years ago. So we're making progress. We'd like to do more. We'd like it to be faster, but it's super complex, and we have so many interdependencies with partners wide and far to help us go there. Great question. I thank you for joining today.
That is a great question. I would just add to that the Port of New York and New Jersey is also working hard to electrify and transition to cleaner technology. Our terminal in Port Newark was actually the first to deploy zero-emission electric trucks. And not too far from here, we're actually building an offshore wind port. But if you follow the news, as we try to electrify and switch to zero-emission technology, we need the electricity to support that, yet we're actually on the verge of losing one of the most important renewable energy projects here in New York, which is Empire Wind, which will supply 816 megawatts of power directly to New York City to help allow us to have more capacity. So But Mike, if you wanted to add anything about Port of New York, Port of New Jersey's electrification and switch and progression towards renewable technology.
So 2 years ago, the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey released our net zero plan, which is our framework to get to net zero by 2050, not just at the seaport, but across all of our line businesses, right? So we have the 3 major airports plus 2 others. We have tunnel and bridge facilities. Talk about a lot of scope 3 emissions, right? Hugely important. We have the path rail system. So, you know, in our little bit of the world, as Gene said, you know, we're advancing these technologies as we can. We were very fortunate to receive over $450 million from the federal government Clean Ports program that's going to advance electrification of cargo handling equipment at the port, right? One of the challenges that you see today, and again, Gene alluded to it, is, you know, with trucks, it's having the infrastructure in place, right, to recharge these vehicles, but it's also the technology behind it. It's one thing to put it in a truck, but to put it in a straddle carrier or a rubber-tired gantry crane that's lifting 120,000-pound boxes, they only get so many turns before they need an opportunity charge. And so the port would come to gridlock if you implemented that technology today. So we are taking a very deliberate approach, okay, to implement where we can, when we can. And again, hopefully, you know, those technologies, and they continue to catch up, but it's going to take some time.
Yes?
My name is Samantha. I'm currently a senior at K University. So I was wondering about the sustainability aspect as far as marine life and how, and if you guys are prioritizing just marine life and biodiversity farming within the waterways that you are looking to mobilize.
That could be a completely new panel.
That's a new.
And it's really complicated, but I'll share with you and I'll give you my context because we've got some really great people that have been working on this for a couple of decades now. We have several thousand species that have been rejuvenated in the harbors around Los Angeles and Long Beach and the San Pedro Bay. We also have one of our key partners, Altasea, which is an urban marine research institute that is working on aquaculture and hydroelectric energy. So there's a lot going on, and I can point you to some of the research that's been done thus far and maybe give you context if you're interested in talking more about it. Thank you.
Yes?
Following up on that question about air quality, and it's very good to hear about your targets in 2030, 2035, where LA has done a lot of the planning. I'm actually working on a port in Port Providence, where obviously much smaller port, and there's an issue there with idling, vessels, obviously. Smaller port, can't use shore power. What type of, what do you imagine in terms of full shore power, capabilities of Port of New Jersey and LA? Also obviously it's a global issue related to electrification of water fleets and that sort of thing. How do you see that progressing, over the next decade or two? What sort of commitment are you able to do given, the weight discharge and works, from vessel, idling vessels is pretty extreme.
Yeah, a couple quick hits and I'll turn it over to Mike. One, I see the alternative marine power, shore power technology advancing. One of our schools back out in LA is designing a hydrogen fuel cell container that's mobile that can connect to any size ship. We've also got a mobile bonnet system that runs by barge today that we think can be moved landside that would be an emissions capture. And as you know, 3% of the world's pollution is by ocean-going vessel. We, along with Maersk and a couple of other partners, brought in the Alette Maersk last summertime that was run from central China to LA on e-methanol and was successful. A 16-day run with a 16,000 TEU vessel, so a workhorse type ship in our business. But there's a lot more that has to go into this to bring costs down and make availability broader on both sides of the Pacific, as well as get into the European trade.
Thanks, Gene. Yeah, the scalability of alternative fuels is huge. It's just not there yet. But we continue to look at a variety of alternatives. We're kind of tracking what's going on worldwide relative to alternative fuels. One of our tenant partners through the Clean Ports program is going to implement shore power. And we also have a clean vessel incentive program where we actually make payments to ocean carriers to slow steam once they get within 20 nautical miles of the port. Does it cut out emissions? No, but it does reduce them to a point where they're less harmful than they otherwise could be.
Okay, so I'm being told we're running out of time, but I'm going to give everybody up here, putting everybody on the spot a little as we wrap this up. I'll start with Gene, talking about challenges. Anything that keeps you up at night?
No, I sleep pretty well, but I do run to work every day. And I would say this, that 21% of our nearly $30 trillion GDP in this country is made up of ports and associated businesses and partners. This port industry has a light on it again, a spotlight on it again. Let's use it to the best of our ability. All our ports nationwide need to be running at top speed to fuel this American economy. What a privilege to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. And Mike, same question?
Yeah, same thing. My wife is constantly amazed at how quickly I fall asleep when my head hits the pillow. It's 90 seconds or less. But in terms of, I would say, challenges, one of the things I think we need to be able to do is to integrate the supply chain across all nodes. We had a pretty big wake-up call with the pandemic, and a lot of the issues that you saw at ports didn't necessarily start at the ports. There was, lack of capacity, whether it be inland trucking or railheads, and one of the things that we're working on constantly through our Council on Port Performance, which is a group that brings together all the stakeholders in the supply chain, is to better connect all these nodes so that, when we do get to 16, 18-hour, truck days, we know that the warehouse is open and that there's going to be, the Class 1 railroad is there to pick it up and take it out to the Midwest. It's, again, not keeping me up at night, but it is something that we work on every single day to make sure that we can have that interconnectivity.
And I'm going to give Jesse the last word.
Okay.
Slightly different question, I think. I'm going to
Oh,
modify
good.
it a little. At your work at SBDIC, you have two ports that are in your area of concern, and you have a lot of disadvantaged community as well. Anything that keeps you up at night about what's happening today in Brooklyn and your work at SBDIC or BMT?
Yeah, I mean, unlike you
And that's
guys, I do have trouble sleeping at night. So,
Because you're doing important work.
The most immediate thing that comes to mind, I'm sure many of you have seen the news, that the federal administration put a stop work order on the construction of Empire Wind 1, which is Equinor's massive offshore wind farm located in the New York Bight. And that has major impacts on local economic development. I mean, Mike referred to the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. That's where the operations and maintenance port is currently being constructed. I think it's about 50% complete. Mm-hmm. But it is at risk right now, not just the offshore part, but I think the onshore part too. And so when this kind of shockwave hits major infrastructure projects, it sends a message to the market that investment in these kind of infrastructure projects is really, really risky. And so I am kept up at night and thinking about the massive investment that's gone into ports in New York and New Jersey for the offshore wind industry, which is incredibly important in meeting our climate goals. And if we're not able to meet those goals, we're at tremendous risk personally, all of us together. But in terms of economic development, all the small businesses that we've been working with to help them access contracts in these opportunities, all the folks that we're trying to help get jobs on these ports and on these projects are at risk as well. So I think what keeps me up at night is the thought that some of these major projects on coastal states that are port related are at risk today, and we're all hoping that 4 years from now, yes, they'll come back online, more investment will come, but we shouldn't count on that. We all need to work on that to make sure that we can move things forward in the right direction.
Yeah. Certainly safe to say we need stability. So Jesse, Mike, Gene, thank you very much for being here today, all of you. Thank you very much for being here. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you.